An aging war hero loses his only boat when a billionaire's yacht crashes into it. The video goes viral, and people online mock him without mercy. But the next morning, something happens in the harbor that silences the entire town. In the summer of 2016, along the quiet edges of Charleston, South Carolina, John Miller lived alone in a modest, stilt house that overlooked the harbor. At 68 years old, John was a retired Coast Guard rescue swimmer who had long since traded the chaos of active duty for the slow, predictable rhythm of the tides. His home, weathered and sun-bleached, stood on wooden legs above the marsh, surrounded by reeds that swayed with the ocean breeze. It was simple, but it held everything he needed: solitude, silence, and the sound of the water. Each morning just before sunrise, he made his way down the creaking dock to untie his boat, a small wooden vessel named Caroline, after his late wife. The boat had seen better days. Its white paint had faded to a dusty gray, the trim flaked at the edges, and the hull bore the deep scratches of decades spent cutting through salt water. Yet John kept her seaworthy. He sanded her planks himself, applied sealant in the spring, and checked every line and cleat with the precision of a man who had once trusted his life to the sea. Though the harbor had changed over the years, with more luxury boats, tourist tours, and tech money drifting in, John remained a constant. Locals recognized his silhouette long before they recognized his face. He wore the same navy windbreaker most days, the same cap pulled low, and always moved with the quiet certainty of someone who needed no audience. While others in the area might have retired to golf courses or family visits, John chose routine. Routine gave shape to the days. It was in the sound of Caroline's motor sputtering to life, the feel of the rope in his calloused hands, and the scent of salt and engine oil at dawn. He rarely spoke of his past, but everyone seemed to know a version of it. Some said he'd saved a dozen lives in a hurricane off the Gulf. Others claimed he once dived into icy waters to pull a sinking crew to safety. John never corrected them. He had little interest in storytelling or correction. What mattered to him was today's tide, today's weather, and the state of his boat. Though he kept mostly to himself, he had quietly built a reputation for kindness. He'd helped stranded tourists restart rented boats, assisted young fishermen with tangled nets, and lent a hand during storms without being asked. He never expected anything in return. That, perhaps, was why people respected him. In a harbor that often celebrated noise and spectacle, John was a man of few words, steady hands, and unspoken integrity. Charleston's skyline had risen over the years, its waterfront filled with glass, chrome, and white hulls. But down at the far end of the dock, where the old slips met the marsh, there was still one man and one boat, rising with the tide, untouched by time. On a bright Saturday morning at the height of the summer season, the harbor of Charleston buzzed with the hum of tourists, fishing boats, and charter cruises. The air smelled of sunscreen and salt, the kind of day made for photographs and laughter. But beneath the surface of the water, deeper currents moved in silence, unaware of the noise above them. Just after 9, a large white yacht turned into the harbor mouth, catching the sun on its polished chrome and mirrored windows. The name Sky Queen was emblazoned in gold across the stern, gleaming like it belonged in Monaco rather than South Carolina. The vessel cut through the water with mechanical precision, the engines humming with power, its bow high and proud. On board, a dozen people lounged with cocktails and cameras, unaware of the quiet rhythms of the small harbor they were disturbing. Austin Bradley, 35, stood on the upper deck. A tech investor from New York, he had made headlines just weeks earlier for purchasing a sprawling waterfront estate a mile down the shore. He arrived in Charleston with ambition, arrogance, and little interest in local customs. Regulations and right-of-way protocols were irrelevant to him. He believed money granted him freedom, and the harbor was just another playground to claim. As Sky Queen surged forward, it created a deep wake that rolled out in thick, fast-moving waves. On the far side of the marina, John Miller stood at the edge of the dock, his hands on the mooring line of Caroline. He had just returned from a quiet morning trip along the inlet and was preparing to tie her off. The old boat bobbed gently beside him, its hull creaking softly as it settled. Then the first wave struck, The initial surge lifted the Caroline sharply, slamming her side against the wooden piling. The second wave followed instantly, hitting harder, and the impact split a section of the starboard hull with a sickening crack. John lunged forward, but there was nothing to hold. Water poured in rapidly through the breached side. The boat groaned under its own weight as her structure buckled. With one final lurch, she began to sink. John staggered back onto the dock, helpless, watching as the Caroline, his companion, his ritual, his memory, was swallowed by the churning harbor. The stern disappeared first, then the bow, then the mast. Bits of wood and rope floated briefly on the surface before drifting out of sight. He could only stand there, soaked and stunned, the mooring line still in his hand, useless now. All around him, people stood still, some with phones raised, capturing the scene in sharp digital focus. Tourists whispered. A child laughed somewhere behind him, but no one stepped forward. No one asked if he was all right. No one tried to stop it. It was as if the moment belonged more to screens than to the man who had lost something irreplaceable. Within hours, marina workers towed the floating debris out of sight. The dock was swept, the wet boards left to dry in the afternoon sun. By sunset, the spot looked untouched, as if no boat had ever been there. Caroline was gone, her absence registered by none but the man who had loved her. What remained was a gap on the dock, a quiet void in the water, and the hollow ache that settled in John's chest like seawater in a broken hull. By the following morning, the harbor had returned to its usual rhythm, but online, the story of the sinking had taken on a life of its own. A shaky phone video, taken from the dock by a tourist, showed the moment Caroline cracked and went under. The clip spread rapidly, posted and reposted across platforms, edited with captions, filters, and background music. Some viewers expressed sympathy, calling the event tragic, but others turned it into entertainment. Comments ranged from casual pity to cruel mockery. Strangers called John an old fool, a relic clinging to a world that no longer existed. A few defended him, but their voices were buried beneath the noise. By noon, the hashtag #BoomerBoat was trending. Users made jokes about outdated vessels, slow old men, and the inevitability of progress. They laughed at the idea of mourning a piece of wood and fiberglass. They speculated about the cost of replacing it, offering unsolicited advice and sarcastic solutions. No one mentioned the man behind the boat. No one questioned what he might have felt standing on the dock with splinters in his hands and a hollow where his second heart had been. John spent that day in silence. The curtains in his small, stilt house remained drawn, the phone unplugged. He made himself coffee he didn't drink, opened a can of soup he didn't finish, and sat for hours at the worn kitchen table with a faded shoebox in front of him. Inside were old photographs, black and white, some creased, others barely legible. One showed him in uniform, younger, stronger, a medal pinned to his chest. Another captured Caroline in her early days, newly painted, the water calm and mirror-like behind her. He ran a weathered finger along the edge of a letter addressed in familiar handwriting. His wife's name echoed silently in the room. No officials visited. No apology came. The harbor master issued a short statement to the local paper, confirming that the Caroline had not met modern safety standards and had not been equipped with radar reflectors or certified flotation aids. The insurance company declined coverage, citing outdated registration and insufficient compliance with current marine policy guidelines. Bureaucracy closed its doors without hesitation. On paper, it was a simple case. A non-compliant vessel, an accident, no liability. Another line filed, another story forgotten. To those in the city and beyond, it had been a minor event, a disruption, an old boat destroyed, an inconvenience at worst. But to John, it was something far deeper. The Caroline had been built with his own hands. Every joint and plank had been shaped by time, by healing, by memory. After his wife passed, it had been the one place that didn't feel empty. It had been refuge, ritual, continuity. Losing it felt like losing her all over again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the marsh shimmered in gold, John stood on his porch, looking toward the slip where Caroline used to rest. The space was bare now, the water calm and undisturbed. A silence settled over the house and the dock and the man who watched from the shadows. Nothing marked the loss but the absence itself. The next morning arrived under a blanket of dense fog. The harbor, usually bright with the first glint of sun on water, was muted and gray. The outlines of boats and docks softened into ghostly shapes. The air held a heavy stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of mooring ropes and the distant cry of gulls. Locals moved slowly through their routines, unaware that something unusual was approaching from the sea. Without warning, the silence shifted. From the mist, 3 Coast Guard cutters emerged in formation, their hulls cutting through the water with solemn precision. No horns sounded. No radio broadcasts announced their arrival. They simply appeared, their flags at half-mast, their decks manned with officers in full-dress uniforms standing at attention. The sight alone drew people from their shops and homes, their footsteps gathering near the docks as the ship slowed and came to a coordinated stop. On the lead vessel, a tall figure stood near the bow. Vice Admiral Charles Whelan, dressed in immaculate white, held a neatly folded American flag against his chest. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. When the gangplank dropped, he descended without a word, accompanied by a color guard and 2 aides carrying a briefcase and a polished wooden box. By then, a crowd had gathered. Word had begun to spread, first among the dock workers, then to the local cafe, and finally to the tourists who sensed something important was happening. Phones were raised, but not like the day before. The mood had changed. The air felt heavier. Children were hushed. Elders removed their hats. No one knew exactly why the Coast Guard had come, but all understood instinctively that it wasn't a drill. The Admiral walked steadily down the pier and continued past the crowd toward the weathered stilt house that stood alone at the edge of the marsh. John Miller stood at the top of his porch stairs, still in his flannel shirt and worn boots, watching in silence. He hadn't received a letter. No one had called. But something in the straight lines of those ships told him this was not an ordinary visit. The ceremony was brief, but exact. On the small stretch of dock near John's house, the color guard assembled, facing the water. The Admiral stepped forward and opened the briefcase. Inside was a collection of documents, carefully preserved, some decades old. He began to read from them, his voice measured, clear. They spoke of a rescue operation during Hurricane Isaac in 1992, when John, then serving as a chief rescue swimmer, had risked his life to save 14 men from a capsized freighter in the Gulf of Mexico. Few had ever heard the story. It had been filed, archived, buried beneath years of quiet retirement. But the records were real. The names were real. The medals awarded, the commendations written, real. As the Admiral read, those gathered began to realize the scale of what had been overlooked. John had never spoken of it. He had never asked for recognition. But now, the service he gave was being returned with the full weight of the uniform he once wore. When the reading ended, the folded flag was presented. It was the same ritual used at military funerals, but this was not a farewell. It was a restoration, a way of saying what had never been said and honoring what had long been known only to a handful of men and dusty archives. The Admiral saluted. The officers did the same, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustle of fabric in the wind. There were no speeches, no music, just silence, and the presence of something long overdue. For the town that had watched a boat sink and done nothing, it was a reckoning. For John, it was not pride that filled him, but something quieter, not satisfaction, but peace. The kind that comes not from being seen, but from knowing that finally someone had remembered. The story of the ceremony spread across the country faster than anyone in the harbor could have expected. Within hours, regional news stations picked it up. By evening, it had made national broadcasts. Newspapers printed headlines that blended reverence with disbelief. Phrases like "silent hero remembered" and "a town awakes too late." Online articles went viral. Photos of John standing beside the Vice Admiral shared millions of times. His name, once unknown outside the local marina, now traveled across timelines, comment sections, and breakfast tables. Reporters began arriving in Charleston. They knocked on doors up and down the waterfront, speaking with neighbors who suddenly realized they had lived beside history. Interviews were given on porches, in diners, and along the dock where Caroline once floated. Children at the nearby elementary school began drawing pictures of John in uniform. often standing tall on a boat with a waving flag behind him. Their teachers hung the drawings in classroom windows, where they fluttered with pride against the glass. Letters poured in from all over the country. Former crew members, long retired, wrote to thank him. Families of those he had once helped reached out to share their memories. One envelope contained a medal John hadn't even known existed, returned with a note from a Navy clerk who had discovered it misplaced in the archives. The small mailbox at his gate, once empty for weeks, now overflowed daily. Austin Bradley, the yacht owner, could not ignore the shift in public sentiment. Criticism mounted against him online and in print. Under growing pressure, he issued a formal apology. It was carefully worded, released through a publicist, and posted to his verified social media accounts. He promised donations to maritime education and pledged support for veteran programs. But the response was cold. Most saw through the gesture. Commentators called it image control, a too-late attempt to rewrite the narrative. The public had already chosen its side. Meanwhile, something more meaningful was taking shape behind the scenes. At the United States Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, a small group of cadets had followed the story with interest and admiration. Inspired by John's legacy, they reached out to Charleston's harbor officials with a plan. With the support of the Academy's leadership and several private donors, they proposed to rebuild the Caroline, not as a symbol but as a working vessel. They studied photographs, blueprints, and hand-drawn sketches John had kept in a leather-bound notebook tucked behind his kitchen stove. They worked quietly, without media attention, in a private boatyard just outside town. 1 month later, under a pale morning sky, John stood at the edge of the marina where his boat had once been destroyed. The water was calm, the air filled with the scent of varnish, cedar, and salt. A low hum of activity buzzed behind him as the last preparations were made. Then, from around the bend, a freshly built boat came into view. It moved slowly, pushed by a small tug, her silhouette strikingly familiar. The name painted across the bow was the same: Caroline. The hull gleamed with new paint, the lines crisp and precise, yet the design was unmistakably his. Every detail matched the original, right down to the curve of the stern and the custom woodwork on the helm. Only subtle improvements had been added: reinforced framing, modern navigational instruments hidden discreetly inside, and a solar panel embedded flush with the deck. It was the same boat, and yet it was reborn. As the cadets helped secure the vessel to the dock, John approached slowly. His hand brushed the railing, fingertips tracing the grain of the wood. The dock beneath him creaked just as it always had, but now carried the weight of a new beginning. Around him, the crowd stood respectfully at a distance, watching but not intruding. Cameras remained lowered. This moment belonged to him. For the first time in weeks, John smiled. Not out of politeness, not for a camera, but because something that had been taken from him without warning had, against all odds, returned. Not as it was, but as it should be. A tribute not just to the past, but to the values that had carried him through the storms. Duty, humility, endurance. The Caroline had come home. 3 months had passed. Summer in Charleston was drawing to a close, and with it came a soft shift in the rhythms of the harbor. The air grew cooler in the mornings. The marshes began to lose their deep green hue, and the sunset stretched longer across the horizon. Yet something more enduring than the season had changed. The harbor itself felt different. Where once people passed by without notice, they now slowed when they saw John Miller. Tourists approached him with quiet respect, asking to shake his hand, sometimes just offering a nod of recognition. Locals, who had once seen him as part of the landscape, now saw him as something more, a living link to a kind of courage rarely spoken about, and even more rarely honored. John resumed his early morning trips out to sea, though he no longer went alone. Children from the summer maritime program gathered by the dock before sunrise, waiting eagerly to board the new Caroline. They learned from him how to coil a rope properly, how to listen to the water, how to feel the wind without needing a forecast. He taught them the language of the ocean, the creak of the hull, the pull of a current, the way a knot could hold not just 2 ropes together, but 2 lives. He never raised his voice, never lectured. Instead, he showed them through patience and repetition, allowing them to fail and try again. These were lessons not just in seamanship, but in responsibility, focus, and respect. For the sea, for each other, and for something larger than themselves. Parents watched from the shore, grateful that their children were learning from a man who carried a lifetime's worth of quiet wisdom in his weathered hands. At the edge of John's small property, a new plaque had been installed by the town council. It was mounted on a post just above the waterline, where it caught the light at sunset. The inscription read, "In memory of Caroline, and of all those who are not afraid to save." People often stopped to read it, many taking a moment to sit on the nearby bench that had been donated by a veterans group. Flowers sometimes appeared at its base, left anonymously. In the evenings, John returned to the dock, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by neighbors or visiting servicemen. He would sit and watch the last boats glide home, the gulls circling overhead, the tide rolling in without hurry. The silence that once had felt like solitude now felt like presence, an echo of all that had been lost and all that had been found again. One evening in late August, as the cicadas quieted and the lanterns along the dock flickered on, a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the pier. It was Austin Bradley, dressed in simple clothes, his sunglasses tucked into his shirt collar. But this time he was not alone. A small boy, no older than 8, walked beside him, eyes wide with curiosity, hands clutching a coiled rope. They approached slowly, without cameras or entourage. John looked up, acknowledging them with a nod. No words were exchanged, no speeches offered. Instead, John rose and motioned to the cleat on the dock. The boy stepped forward, uncertain at first, and John guided his hands in silence, showing him how to secure the line with a proper hitch. It took a few tries, but the knot held. In that small, unspoken moment, there was no ceremony, no judgment. Just an old sailor passing down what he knew, and a man who had once acted carelessly watching his son learn something lasting. It was not about making amends or rewriting what had happened. It was about choosing what happened next. That night, as the sky darkened and the stars emerged over the water, John remained at the dock long after the others had gone. The boat rocked gently in its slip. The plaque gleamed in the moonlight, and the harbor, for all its noise and motion, seemed to pause just for a moment, to remember what mattered. Not the grandeur of yachts or headlines, but the steady hands that held the ropes when storms came, and the quiet men who taught others how to hold them too.